Welcome to the Lutheran History Podcast, where we cover over 500 years of Lutheranism. We hear news stories, examine old heroes of faith, and dig into the who, how, what, and why of history making. Whether you are a Lutheran seeking to understand your faith's rich roots, a history lover, or a person looking for stories of trials, tragedies, and triumphs, you'll find what you're looking for right here. Today's guest is Thomas Jacobson, who is currently serving as a part-time pastor at Good Shepherd Evangelical Lutheran Church in Lindy, Nebraska. He is also adjunct instructor of historical theology at the Institute of Lutheran Theology in Brookings, South Dakota. He completed his Bachelor of Arts at Augustana University in South Dakota in 2002. He got his Master of Divinity degree at Luther Seminary in 2006, and he got his PhD degree also at Luther Seminary in 2018. His main research interest is, like mine, American Lutheran history. He focuses more, though, on the Scandinavian-American church experience. He resides in Menno, South Dakota, with his wife and 3 children. All the kids' names, he tells me, have Scandinavian ancestry influences in them, which, as a history buff, I really think that's cool. He's constantly, or not constantly, but often sharing his information and research on Hans Nielsen Hauge, with the focus of his PhD thesis. This is the first time we're doing a straight up thesis talk. I've seen he's written other articles, but man, they're just, they don't do it justice as much as his thesis has done. So we want to get into that. If you have asked me to do a podcast on a thesis and I said I don't do that, I apologize. I might be a little more open-minded now because of that. My idea as a podcast host is really to try to get people to be able to access other people's research. And if someone has a thesis, they might be holding on to that for some reason. But Dr. Jacobson here has made his thesis available online, and he can be contacted, or you can contact me about where to find that. So all introductions aside, Dr. Jacobson, thank you for joining us today.
Glad to be here with you.
Now, for the sake of our audience members, like myself, who may not have a lot of familiarity with our topic of Hans Nielsen Hauge, can you take a minute or two to just briefly define and describe Haugeism?
Okay. Well, Haugeanism is sort of a Norwegian tradition that originated in the revival activity of the man Hans Nielsen Hauge in Norway in the late 18th century and early 19th century. So Hauge was born in 1771, and he died in 1824. Haugeanism is something that came out of that revival movement that Hauge led as he traversed Norway over the course of a number of years. And he had been imprisoned for 10 years. He was released after a while for he had been imprisoned because of his violation of Norwegian law at the time, which prohibited lay people from leading religious gatherings known as conventicles. And this was an archaic law. Hauge believed that this law should be considered de facto repealed because other laws on the books from that time also were not taken seriously, such as laws mandating church attendance, also laws prohibiting profanity. Hauge noted that these laws were no longer enforced in any way, and so this Conventicle Act of 1741 prohibited lay people from conducting religious gatherings without the presence of an ordained minister. At first, Hauge decided that he would try to comply with that law. But when the local clergy did not often respond, Hauge believed that he was free to do this. Hauge received what he considered to be a call from God when he was a young man, 25 years old. In 1796, he was plowing the field in the spring of that year, in April. And while he was singing the hymn, it was actually a Dano-Norwegian translation of a German hymn that we know as "Jesus, I Long for Thy Blessed Communion." And while he was singing this hymn, he had a mystical experience, and he believed that God was calling him to reach out to his country at a time of spiritual stagnation. And so Hauge began this work locally. He tried to edify people. Interestingly, though, he never encouraged anybody to depart from the established Church of Norway, which was Lutheran in its establishment. He encouraged people to remain faithful members of the church, to receive the sacraments at the church. But these were supplemental religious gatherings. Hauge was not the first person to do these things. This was a part of the broader pietistic tradition in Lutheranism that had gone back a couple of centuries. So anyway, I guess the short answer to your question is that Haugeanism is sort of an ethical religious ethos that emerged from Norway at that time, rooted in the activity of Hans Nielsen Hauge.
Well, thank you for that answer, and we'll get more into the what of this history for sure as we get into this interview today. And now just maybe to bring it up to immediately to the present, fast forward 200-ish years, what is the general attitude towards Haugeanism today among American Lutherans? Mine might be ignorance is the attitude, but of people who know about it, what can you say?
Well, like you said, there is a lot of ignorance of it. A lot of people just don't know what that is. But coming out of the tradition that I do, in the Midwest especially, my variety of Lutheranism has a large part of its roots in the Norwegian background of the Midwest. And over the years, there's kind of an elitism that has reacted against the Haugean pietism that was strong in the Midwest. I'd say the general attitude among many pastors, many of my colleagues, is sort of a dismissive attitude. They tend to look down on the Haugean influence as lacking theological sophistication, emphasizing too much your personal religious experiences, and legalism as well. That's another major criticism of Haugeanism. And, you know, some of these criticisms, of course, might have some degree of legitimacy. There definitely is a strain of that, of all those things in Haugeanism. But there very rarely is a positive assessment of anything that Haugeanism has brought to the Lutheran tradition today. That's just my observation. And if I may share a little anecdote that illustrates this. When I was in my second year of seminary at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. For those who don't know, Luther Seminary today is a merged institution of a couple of different things. But historically, Luther Seminary was the Norwegian American Lutheran Seminary, established after 1917. After that merger took place. And so it was a mixture of the Haugean element of Norwegian American Lutheranism, along with the more, you might say, theologically focused folks. They agreed to merge somewhat grudgingly that year, 1917, to commemorate the Reformation, actually, the 400th anniversary. And it was really interesting to me. One of the first times I heard the name of Hans Nielsen Hauge was that year, would have been 2004, when I was a middler, second-year student at Luther Seminary. And some of my classmates asked me if I would be interested in participating in a party, a celebration, commemorating the death of Hans Nielsen Hauge on October 29th, not October, I'm sorry, March 29th of 1824. So on March 29th of that year, they were planning on having a celebration intended to mock the memory of Hans Nielsen Hauge. And at the library at Luther Seminary, there is a commemorative bust of Hans Nielsen Hauge in the library in the corner. The tradition over the years has been for them to borrow, as in steal, the bust of Hans Nielsen Hauge and place it in a central location where the students would drink large amounts of alcohol and have a party. And they're doing this to try to mock his memory because he's associated with legalism and so forth. So that's about all that people generally know. They have a very negative assessment of him and his legacy. But this is actually what piqued my interest in Hauge. and the tradition that came after him, because I knew that there must be more to the story than that. So, and indeed there is.
Yeah, kind of a little bit more than a shallow butt of a joke kind of history. Yeah, very interesting. So that's it kind of formulates people's impression of him in a unofficial way, I guess. So, and now you've kind of formally answered the informal protest, I guess you might say. So, well, and now let's talk more about the academic side of it, not just the social cultural response on the seminary campus. Can you describe the historiography on Haugeanism within American Lutheranism prior to your own thesis? Kind of a brief run through of that.
Sure. Well, the quick answer is that there really isn't much of anything. And that's the reason, part of the reason why my dissertation is the length that it is because there really isn't a lot that's been directly written about the history of Haugeanism. And partially this is because of this attitude that people have had about Haugeanism over the years. They don't want to touch the topic with a 10-foot pole because they don't think it's worthy of study. Haugeanism gets referred to in a few different places. You know, it gets referenced in, obviously, the broader history of Norwegian American Lutheranism. People talk about it there, but there was never any real specific focus on it. And basically what was out there before I started writing about it was there were a couple of books that had been produced by a Haugean society in among American Lutherans back in the 1940s. So these were books that were designed to try to preserve the history, the legacy of Haugeanism, but they were written from an internal perspective. It was not any kind of objective analysis of anything. But the publication of those books themselves illustrated some important things to me about the history of Haugeanism. These books were designed to try to serve as an apology for the Haugean tradition in American Lutheranism. But really, other than that, there's not been much. And there's really, even among Norwegian American Lutherans today, a couple of weeks ago, I was asked to come and give a presentation about Hauge to this Norwegian Heritage Society in Wisconsin. And I was a little nervous about this because I wanted to talk about Hauge. And I thought, oh, well, maybe these people know everything about this already. I mean, maybe they don't need me to come. Well, I got there anyway, and I talked about it, and everybody was amazed because they had heard the name of Hauge before, but nobody had ever sat down and just laid it out there for them, that this is what he did, and then this is what the result was. So, yeah, there just has not been a lot written about it.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to my next question. At least part of your dissertation just focused on adding information that wasn't out there. So in your own words, what were the purposes or the central arguments of your dissertation?
Well, basically what I tried to accomplish with it is try to answer the broad question of what happened to the Haugean element of American Lutheranism over the years. Where did it end up? And so that's basically what I tried to answer. So I went through and I talked about the history of what happened to the educational institutions of the group known as Hauge's Synod. And what I was arguing at the end is that Haugeanism is really a broad ethos that can't be easily contained in any one single organization. But you can detect the influence of Haugeanism in various places. A lot of independent ministries that have arisen over the years really have strong roots in the Haugean, the spiritual energy of the Haugean revival. Part of this is the result of disenfranchisement among these Haugeans, because they didn't really fit very easily into the established church way of doing things. These people were not terribly concerned about institution building. And that's part of the reason why, some of their feelings of disenfranchisement are self-inflicted, because they're not really interested in building up large endowments and things. They're more concerned with the quality of your relationship with God, the quality of your spiritual life. And that's what they emphasized. But that isn't something that actually brings in a lot of money.
No.
So they don't really have a lot to draw on there. So anyway, broadly speaking, what happened to Haugeanism is what I thought to answer. And underneath that, of course, you get lots of other issues that pop up.
So you've told us a bit about the characteristics of Haugeanism just now. We've already mentioned the founder. Anything else you want to add about just the characteristics of Haugeanism and what it is? What's the essence of it?
Okay. Well, this is kind of a complicated question, because Haugeanism in Norway itself is something that was able to exist or coexist with the established Church of Norway. They were understood to have their freedom to conduct their private conventicles, their spiritual meetings, their edification meetings. They would gather together on a Sunday afternoon, and they would read various writings from various spiritual people of the past. Martin Luther's House Postils, they would sometimes read. They would read medieval mystical theologians like Thomas à Kempis or Bernard of Clairvaux, or people like this. Müller was another one, a German mystical theologian, and various people like this. Eric Pontoppidan. Eric Pontoppidan was he was a Danish pietist bishop who served as the bishop of Bergen, Norway. And he is a huge influence on later Haugeanism through his catechism, or his explanation of Martin Luther's catechism, memorized by Lutheran confirmation students in Norway and America for many years. So these conventicles, or these small groups, would get together for edification and prayer, but yet they also were members of the State Church of Norway. But when these people began to find themselves the urge to immigrate, interestingly, Hauge died in 1824. But the following year is when emigration from Norway to America began. And so on that first boat that came from Norway, there were some of these Haugeans. And they got over here, and they didn't obviously have a state church structure to work with. So the question is what do we do? Mm-hmm. So American Haugeanism, as it developed over time, sought to combine the tradition of informal type spiritual meetings along with like sacramental worship in the church. So Haugeanism in American Lutheranism, Lutherans that were considered themselves Haugeans in America, their worship experience differed somewhat from the more established formal traditions from Norway as well as other places. And that did not always mesh well. So with their formal counterparts, the formal counterparts kind of looked down upon them for their lack of sophistication, their lack of liturgy, and the Haugeans looked down upon those people for not really having a true spiritual life. Of course, both of those criticisms are a bit overly simplistic, but anyway, the Haugeans in America, their worship experience was rather different than other places, and so they would tend to emphasize free prayer. They'd often encourage lay people to stand up and offer a prayer to begin worship. They would read scriptures, but there wasn't really the formal liturgy. They would use the formal liturgy of the Church of Norway for baptism and communion. But other than that, their worship experience was really quite, it was less structured. Mm-hmm. And so this is something that's going to continue to be an issue as these Haugean Lutherans tried to merge eventually with these others. The question was, are they going to allow our tradition to have free reign? Are we going to have the freedom to do this? Haugeans also took from them their emphasis on Christian activity in the world. It's interesting that a lot of times, pietism is accused of, quietism, not really being active or anything like this. But Haugeanism was known for like its work ethic, their emphasis on Christian witness in society, mission, service. In my piece of the Lutheran tradition, the Haugeans were strong contributors to foreign mission societies. These mission societies in places like China, Madagascar, these were stocked with Haugeans. So it was a huge part of their tradition too. So they were strong on mission and service. And of course, along with this is the accusation of legalism. The Haugeans in Norway were known for taking a stance of adiaphora, against things being adiaphora, in reference to common amusements. So the Haugeans, because of their spiritual seriousness, did not believe in Christians engaging in things like card playing, going to the theater, dancing, and other such things.
Would alcohol be included in that too? Or
in some cases, yeah.
Okay.
Interestingly, Hauge himself probably was not a huge. He was not totally opposed to the consumption of alcohol. He would have been opposed to excess, obviously.
Yeah.
But in Norway at the time, it was not uncommon for communities to have their own distilleries and breweries and things like this. And Hauge encouraged those kinds of initiatives. He would have spoken out against drunkenness. There was one time when Hauge had too much to drink when he was a young man, and he vowed that he would not do that again. But yeah, there's a strong sense of ethical seriousness that accompanied the Haugeans too.
Yeah, and I guess that the legalism thing, that's a fine line. Practically speaking, if you want to structure your own life one way as this is a good way to do it, outside of what Scripture says, but once you start saying this is what everyone has to do beyond Scripture, then that legalism charge comes up. So I guess maybe my question, just to get a little more context on top of my general ignorance, was pietism like a major movement within, especially Norway, prior to Hauge? So, and then did he kind of create his own movement, or was he just kind of like a fuel on the fire and he just kept it going? Can you help me understand that a little bit more?
Sure. Well, as you probably know, pietism is a really broad designation. Yeah. It's very difficult to define. And, I've thought about this for a long time, and I'm not totally convinced it's really that helpful of a word, because there's no real scholarly consensus as to what it is.
Right.
There are some scholars like Ernest Stoffler. I think he might be a Reformed scholar. He defines pietism much more broadly. He views like Lutheran pietism as a part of a broader movement in Christianity in general, of that era and the late 17th into the 18th centuries. But other people provide a much more narrow definition of pietism as a Lutheran phenomenon. But really, when you look at it, a lot of the things that pietists did in Lutheran circles were very similar to what was going on in Reformed circles, English Puritanism of the time, other such things. But pietism, working with the limitations of that word, pietism eventually worked its way into the Scandinavian environment through people who had been trained at German universities. And so Denmark and Norway was a province of Denmark for a very long time. So it was kind of like the redheaded stepchild of the Scandinavian world. But today it's actually one of the wealthiest countries in Europe. But for a long time, Norway was one of the poorest countries in Europe. But a lot of the church leaders of Norway came from Denmark. They were educated at the University of Copenhagen because Norway didn't have its own university until 1811, I believe.
Which is very late for Europe for a European country, yeah.
Right. So they Pietism became a part of the Dano-Norwegian tradition from fairly early on. And so that was always a part of the religious atmosphere. And that's what produced someone like Eric Pontoppidan, who wrote that explanation of Martin Luther's small catechism called Truth unto Godliness. And that was kind of an unofficial confessional document among Norwegian Lutherans for a long time and memorized by confirmation students for years. But so those are the influences on Hauge, as well as, devotional literature used in pietist circles. These writings of medieval mystics, Luther's sermons and other such things. These were available to families to use. But the other thing going on here is the influence of rationalism in theology. As rationalism began to dominate the religious discourse of Europe, that worked its way into the Dano-Norwegian tradition too. And so Hauge was very critical of the Norwegian pastors because he didn't believe that they were really feeding people spiritually. Mm-hmm. And so sermons often ended up being focused on practical topics, things like hygiene and crop rotation, agricultural techniques, and getting vaccines. Kind of an interesting topic.
Yes.
Today.
There's a thesis waiting there, I think. Yeah.
But so the other influence here too is all around Europe there were Moravian influences. So the Herrenhuter tradition. Mm-hmm. Which was closely connected to Lutheranism in many ways. But in Norway, too, there were Moravian-influenced pastors. And Hauge's own pastor at his church in southern Norway was known as a Herrenhuter, a Moravian. And what Hauge found lacking in his preaching was this lack of ethical seriousness. He criticized the Moravians for being overly focused on mystical contemplation of the blood of Christ, and not focused enough on Christian activity in the world. So it's said that he wrote a letter rebuking his confirmation pastor at one point, and so that did not receive a response. But that's part of what fueled Hauge's activity. So all of these influences were sort of floating around there at the time.
Yeah, and it's, I think a big takeaway here, just for the history idea, is it's really hard to understand a movement or even a leader figure in history without understanding what are they reacting to, right, or against in some cases, and that context is important. Yeah, in my own Wyneken research, I'll just briefly mention there is kind of this was northern Germany growing up. There was kind of an almost subculture of mistrust against the organized official church, and that was kind of the awakened movement, which is related to pietism in its own right. But yeah, we just can't trust the system. It's best for us actual believing awakened Christians to continue Christianity on our own, apart from the establishment. So and that's a characteristic of pietism in general, but that's pretty much, it seems that's what Hauge was up to, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and you mentioned already, it's just like pietism is broad and it's a challenge to define. He also said Haugeanism is also broad. It's not just what this one guy did. People had their own takes on it. You also noted in your research that you claim that most, if not all, of the Norwegian American Lutheran groups were influenced in one way or another by Haugeanism. But just for the sake of focus and time and space, you did your primary research on what was called the Haugean Synod or Hauge's Synod. I think it's called a couple different ways. So can you tell us a little bit about life of Hauge's Synod in America?
Sure. Yeah, just to go off what you said, Haugeanism is something that was kind of in the air. It influenced really all of the Norwegian environment, and even some of the major leaders of what was called the Norwegian Synod, which was considered to be the more formal theologically focused group.
And they were, if I'm correct, they were copying the state church was kind of their thing, right? We're just what they were doing, we're doing, right?
Right.
Okay.
And they believed themselves to be the legitimate representation of the Norwegian state church.
Mm-hmm.
The leaders of that group actually developed early on a pretty close relationship with the Missouri Synod, and they had a close alliance there, which would come back to bite them in the long run, because there got to be kind of a reaction against the influence of the Missouri Synod. And in the end, these people in the Norwegian Synod kind of ended up moving closer toward their Norwegian brethren. But even the leaders of the Norwegian Synod, I mean, they acknowledged that what Hauge did years ago might have been necessary. They understood that he was responding to a particular situation, but their contention is that Haugeanism as an emphasis today is no longer necessary, because now that you actually have good quality preachers, you don't need to focus on like empowering the laity to fill that role in that way. So it's kind of a Haugeanism also expressed itself in a lot of these other Norwegian American Lutheran groups, and it's too complicated a history for me to try to lay it out there right here. But one of the groups was called the Norwegian Augustana Synod. Those are the folks that ended up founding my old college, Augustana University in Sioux Falls. They were a really small group, but they were also heavily influenced by Haugeanism, to the point where there probably wasn't much of a difference between them and what was called Hauge's Synod. Anyway, the story of Hauge's Synod is is itself a complicated one, because these people take their roots from a man who is a Haugean lay preacher named Elling Eilsen. Elling Eilsen came from Norway in the 1840s, and he was known for his dislike of organization. He didn't really feel it was that necessary. He was more concerned about people hearing the word of God, responding. And there was a loose organization that was founded in 1846. And interestingly, the official title of that group was called the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. That was the title of it. But it was more commonly known as Eilsen's Synod. So these people were also known as the Ellingians, the followers of Eilsen. Well, Eilsen wasn't really much of a leader in the sense of organizer, and people over the years kind of began to react against his attitude, his authoritarianism. Eventually, in 1875, there were enough people that reacted against this that they outvoted Eilsen himself, and they reorganized the church organization to be known as Hauge's Norwegian Evangelical Lutheran Synod in America. So I think they inserted the title Hauge's Synod because they wanted to emphasize that they weren't just followers of Elling Eilsen anymore. So Hauge's Synod carried with it the Haugean emphasis in many ways, but it also was influenced by, there was another parallel movement in Scandinavia at the time, led by Carl Olof Rosenius. Carl Olof Rosenius was another layperson. He influenced people more through his writings. But the difference in emphasis between the Haugeans in Norway at the time and the Rosenians in Sweden had mostly to do with Rosenius focused more upon people finding peace with God. It wasn't as legalistic of a focus. It was more of a positive evangelical type of a focus. And that came to influence the Norwegian environment and Norwegian Haugeanism. So there got to be something of a clash between the Norwegians, the Haugeans in America, between those who were influenced by the Rosenian emphasis and those that were, quote unquote, the pure Haugeans. But I think that that's a big factor in what eventually led to a split there. So in 1875, completed in 1876, Hauge's Synod was formed, but legally it was the legal continuation of this 1846 organization. Eilsen himself ended up breaking off from that group and founding a splinter group that became known as the Eilsen Synod, or I think it was called the Evangelical Lutheran Church, Eilsen Synod. But that was the schismatic group. Anyway, this gets to be a contentious issue because there are some people who claim that Hauge's Synod was the schismatic group when it wasn't really. Well, the Eilsen Synod didn't really ever amount to much. It was kind of a small group, had 20 congregations at its height, I think, and the last of which closed, I think, in 2007, I think.
Oh, okay. So still kind of recent history then, huh?
I think so. I think there was one active congregation as of that date. Okay. But yeah, it was never much. It never amounted to much numerically. But anyway, Hauge's Synod remained one of the smaller of the Norwegian groups. But it had a heavy concentration of congregations in certain places, one of which was central Iowa. There was a pretty heavy group of them there. The region around Chicago, Illinois, that had a concentration of Hauge's Synod congregations. Central Wisconsin, around Madison, that area. Southeastern Minnesota, northwestern Minnesota, western North Dakota, eastern South Dakota, and interestingly, Alberta, Canada, had a large concentration of Hauge's Synod congregations. So all told, I believe that Hauge's Synod had congregations in 13 U.S. states and I think 3 Canadian provinces. So that's the geographic distribution of it.
Okay.
But they had a seminary. They eventually founded a seminary in Red Wing, Minnesota, which is right on the border of Wisconsin and Minnesota. Really beautiful location. Red Wing Seminary was kind of like the beating heart of Hauge's Synod. They acquired a college in central Iowa, in Jewell, Iowa. It was called Jewell Lutheran College. And over time, these educational institutions just fell on hard economic times, result of the Great Depression, and they just couldn't maintain it anymore. And for that reason, the closure of those educational institutions was a part of Haugean disenfranchisement. Trying to think of some other characteristics of Hauge's Synod.
Well, can I just ask a question? You mentioned they have a seminary and college, and I guess earlier I got the impression they were focused on lay-led services. So they had ordained clergy, just to be clear, but they encouraged lay participation to a higher degree. Is that the best way to understand it? Yeah,
that's very accurate. Okay. They had ordained pastors. In fact, behind me on the wall, there's a photograph. It's a photograph of the graduating class of Red Wing Seminary in 1913. And so you can see there are 7 graduates there. So that gives you a sense of kind of the size of the group that you're dealing with here. They were not opposed necessarily to education. They believed that was important to a degree, but they also emphasized Christian lay activity and the importance of all Christian people to witness to their faith and to be able to offer a testimony of that when called upon. The Haugeans were a group of people that placed a lot more emphasis on spontaneity. They didn't like fixed prayers written in books. They believed that people ought to be able to comment about their faith without prepared remarks. And that set them apart from a lot of the other groups of the time. There was an anecdote that I uncovered in my research where you had a couple of these people, one of which came out of a Haugean background and the other one came out of a Norwegian Synod background, and about how they were called upon to offer some remarks at a graduation ceremony. at one point. And the person that came out of the Haugean background said, yeah, no problem, and went ahead and did that. But the other person said, well, I'm not comfortable doing that without prepared remarks. So that was kind of a way of thinking of the difference between them. Interestingly, in terms of their worship life, the Haugean Lutherans, they tended not to wear any clerical vestments, whereas the other groups did. The Norwegian tradition of that time, the Dano-Norwegian tradition, was to wear a black cassock with a white ruffled collar. Mm-hmm. And so they would wear those things. But the Haugean preachers did not. And they would either wear just an ordinary suit, or they would wear what's called a Prince Albert frock coat, which kind of defeats the whole point in a way, because the pastor would show up wearing a Prince Albert frock coat, and of course nobody else would be wearing that. So it kind of became a vestment in a way, however odd it was. But anyway, that was their way of doing things. And of course they did not use the liturgical chanting like the other Norwegians would have at the time. So there were really two broad strains of worship experience among the Norwegian American Lutherans. The one was the liturgical tradition rooted in the Dano-Norwegian ritual of 1685, and this Haugean sort of what you might call low church emphasis.
Mm-hmm. So they were a synod with ordained clergy. That was something that I needed to clarify. So organizationally, did they stand out from, I guess, I don't know what we're picturing, but like other typical Lutheran synods, especially in the 19th century? Was that similar, or did that operate differently because of that lay emphasis?
Well, it was similar in a lot of ways. They had, annual conventions. They had all of those things, and they would have regional like clusters too, which changed from time to time, just depending on how many congregations there were in an area. I can't quite remember how many like regional subdivisions they had within Hauge's synod, but I think the number 11 is coming to my mind.
Okay.
So these would have been fairly small groups of congregations. And the other thing I'll add that I forgot to mention is that these Hauge synod congregations tended not to be that large. Most of them had official memberships of under 100.
Okay.
There were a few examples, though, of congregations that were quite large. One of which is located not far from where I grew up, just straddling the border of Minnesota and South Dakota. There was a really large Hauge synod congregation with about 700 members.
Wow.
And there was one in central Iowa too, that was about that same size. So those were kind of the big congregations in the public eye.
So do you have any kind of like, what's the average like total membership count or congregational count? Could we get a sense for their size just based on the numbers?
As of 1916, so 1916 would have been the last year that Hauge's synod operated as an independent thing. There were 342 congregations throughout the organization. So out of the three groups that merged in 1917, Hauge's synod was the smallest. Mm-hmm. They had comprised about 8% of the total congregations. So the other one would have been, at the time, the United Norwegian Lutheran Church, which was the largest. And then there was the Norwegian Synod, which would have been in the middle between them.
At this point, we'll take a break in our episode on the Haugean Synod in the United States. And in the next episode, we'll look more at that Haugean spirit and the merged bodies into which it joined.
Still have a lot of Christmas gift shopping left to do? Why not kill 3 birds with 1 stone? By purchasing an item from the Lutheran History Shop, you can write off one more thing from your to-do list. You can get something unique for that Lutheran history lover in your life, and at the same time, you can support this show. At the bottom of each episode description, you will find a link to the Lutheran History Shop. There you can browse an assortment of Lutheran history gear, anything from stickers to mugs to pint glasses, water bottles, and totes. There are also shirts and hoodies that come in dozens of sizes and color options, allowing you to customize your favorite design. So whether you're looking for a figure from Lutheran history to display, or you simply want to show your love for Lutheran history, you'll find what you're looking for at the Lutheran History Shop.